Warning: this video contains discussions of addiction, mental illness, suicide and suicidal ideation, sexual, physical and emotional abuse, homophobia, and transphobia. We all like to think of ourselves as the heroes of our own stories, and we are. But we aren't always heroes, even when we want to believe we are. People don't like thinking of themselves or their actions as unethical, because that would mean that we have made bad choices, and no one wants to think that their choices were bad or wrong. We're all the good guys, aren't we? We can't possibly be the baddies. Even the worst people alive tend to believe that they were or are in the right. There's a reason the expression, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, exists. We all have good intentions, don't we? Now, an author, the person who creates a piece of art, does indeed have things to say with the work of art they are producing. But here's the question. What do we do when that author is unethical in some or another sense? Some people like to label it cancel culture, when a person faces repercussions for their words and actions. But the rest of us use the real term, consequences. We learn that our actions have consequences before we even go to school. But apparently some people need to be educated about that fact. But it is a tricky subject when it comes to authors, or, to use a more broad modern label, content creators. You see, when some politician or something does something heinous, it's a bit easier to cut them off. But when it comes to the people who create the art that we define ourselves by, well, that's a bit harder. When it comes out that someone integral to your upbringing, whose works were foundational to you, is a bad person, well, it can be rather heartbreaking. And you can respond to that in many ways. Some people cut the creator out of their lives entirely. Some stop publicly promoting their enjoyment of that person's work. And others respond with hostility and attack people for daring to question Dr. Seuss or someone similar. There isn't necessarily a correct way to respond, as ethics is one of those difficult subjects that no one agrees on, but it's worth interrogating this. It's worth looking at the whole notion of authorship, problematic authors in particular, and just giving the whole thing a nice lengthy discussion. Something to think about for yourself, because it's always good to question your own ethical framework for life. What do you consider to be right and wrong? I will give my own opinion on this topic, but my opinion is not going to be the opinion of everyone. Some will be more hardcore than me, and others will be less hardcore than me, but I don't take a non-committal centrist viewpoint on this, so no need to worry about that. But before we get into authorship, we should discuss a little thing called death of the author, and how it is often misunderstood or misused. Because if I don't, then I may just have people jumping out to say that I ignore death of the author, and therefore everything I have to say about artistic consumption is moot. But before we get into that, we should always remember that tired old mantra, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism. So, with that out the way, let's get to that discussion. Part 1. The death of the author. Death of the author is a phrase associated with the French literary theorist, semiotician, and philosopher Roland Barthes, who wrote an essay in 1967 called The Death of the Author, hence the name. This short essay, and it is only a few pages long, talks about how much of literary analysis has focused on the author behind the work rather than on the work itself, and that if we assume that an author holds all the meaning behind a work, then what's the point of analyzing it at all? There is no author god, the author is a human. They may not even be aware of all the meanings within their own work. He wants us to interpret literary works rather than adhering to what the author claims the work is about. We need to place the power of interpretation in the hands of the reader rather than the author. But he ends it off in a more poetic way than I. The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. You see, If we place meaning in the hands of the author, then reinterpretation is pointless. The work of any author might as well be destroyed soon after creation, because what's the point of allowing it to last several hundred years if the only meaning available is what the author felt it should be? We do not even have access to what most authors thought of their work. Are there any interviews with Shakespeare about what he meant when he wrote Hamlet? Or is interpretation up to us? A text can change as time goes on. For instance, Sigmund Freud used the Sophocles play Oedipus Rex as his example of the Oedipal complex. This complex is even named after the character Oedipus. And in that play, Oedipus is a man who saves a city from a monster, and then he is given the queen's hand in marriage, and he has 2 kids with her. He later discovers that his wife is actually his mother, and that he was abandoned as a baby. Now, that's just bad luck and coincidence, although it is ancient Greek mythology, and so it wouldn't have been considered bad luck back then. But Oedipus clearly doesn't have an attraction to his mother and an aversion to his father, as the Oedipal complex suggests. It just happened to be a good example from the literary canon that Freud could use to make his point. He also used Prince Hamlet as an example because Hamlet has a bit of a strange relationship with his mom. But that doesn't mean that when Sophocles or Shakespeare wrote their plays that they were thinking, oh, this is going to be great in several hundred years when a random German psychoanalyst comes up with a theory that explains my character. Texts change over time, and we can reinterpret them with new meanings that we, as the reader, project onto them. This is why, for instance, many protest writers have rewritten texts like Robinson Crusoe and Antigone. These texts can have their meanings changed to suit a new audience. But I have actually discussed post-colonial rewriting before, so if you want a lengthier discussion of that, check out my first video. The link will be in the description. Now, this separation of reader and author was shared by a number of people. For instance, a friend and contemporary of Barthes, Michel Foucault, wrote a similar piece about authorship called What is an Author? And he made suggestions about authorship that further question the whole affair. It boils down to 4 open-ended questions. What is an author? What is an author's work? What is a name? And what is the author function? Is an author even necessarily the sole creator of something? Take a look at the current capitalistic model of publishing. Is an author really the sole producer of the meaning in the text? Or are they also editors and agents and managers and marketing people who have an influence over the final product? So, what is that author's work then? Does it include everything? Or just some of the things? And is their name the only thing tied to that work? Ultimately, what the hell is an author? So, if the author loses all their meaning behind things, then you need to find that meaning elsewhere. And that's where the reader comes in. Barthes wrote on this too. His book Essed, and a shorter but similar essay titled Textual Analysis post-Valdemar, look at the highly subjective way a text can be understood by breaking it down by sentence and paragraph to find all the possible meanings one could find. For instance, in Essed, Barthes spends quite some time discussing just the title of Balzac's short story Sarrazin, and even though he spends quite some time on the title alone, he still knows that he has not found all the meanings in that text. He has only found the ones that he was able to find at that particular time. Maybe he thought of more after his book was published. Maybe you'd find a new meaning. Maybe I would. So, if meaning is this subjective, if any of us could potentially find new meanings, then surely the author is metaphorically dead and buried. Aren't they? Well, those who believed in reader response theory certainly believed so, theorists like Stanley Fish and Hans Robert Jauss. Wolfgang Iser, another prominent figure in the field, produced an essay titled The Reading Process, a Phenomenological Approach. Beautiful name. And in it, he espouses his view that the reader should be at the center of meaning construction. The reader should be the one to determine the meaning, never the author. Because there are potentially infinite readers. Are there infinite authors? Or, as he says, if the reader were given the whole story and there were nothing left for him to do, then his imagination would never enter the field. The result would be the boredom that inevitably arises when everything is laid out, cut and dried before us. And in a similar mindset to Barth's reading of Sarrazin and the Curious Case of M. Valdemar, Isa states that one text is potentially capable of several different realizations, and no reading can ever fully exhaust the meaning. We will never find the full meaning in a text. And so we should just keep interpreting and reinterpreting forever. Now, some people have taken issue with this kind of highly personal reading and interpretation, and they believe that we must fully detach from our feelings and seek objective, factual meaning behind a text. Sadly, that meaning is impossible, but two essays that precede The Death of the Author, by W.K. Wimsatt Jr. and M.C. Beardsley, great names, by the way, go very much against all this subjective nonsense. These two men wrote an essay titled The Intentional Fallacy in 1946, and this essay is straight up about how we shouldn't care what the author said and did. And so you can think of it like a spiritual precursor to The Death of the Author. But then, they followed up with an essay in 1949 called The Affective Fallacy. And this essay decried how some people allow their disgusting emotions to shape how they see a text. So basically, they went the opposite way to the reader response people. However, here's the issue with this. We all have a certain emotional response to the text we love and loathe. And when I say text, I mean any literary form. So books, poems, movies, games, whatever. So we all have an emotional response to things, but those emotions can lead us to doing something more analytical. For instance, just having an emotional response to a movie, such as crying because it's sad, may not have much analytical value on its own. But what if I decided, based on the sadness I felt, that I wanted to write an analysis about how that movie produced that sadness? Well, is that still being all emotional? Or is that being critical and analytical? So, while an effective response may not have value on its own in an academic sense, it can spur us to real work. For instance, feminist literary analysis may have been spurred on by disgust at the depiction of explicit and or implicit sexism, but academics who perform robust empirical, feminist analyses of text are not responding with emotion alone. Here's the thing. Death of the Author is great for analysis. It's great to analyze something based on its own merits and to just ignore the author. But we can also analyze something while looking at the author. We can be anti-intentionalist, meaning we don't care what the author said, did, was at all. Or we can be a moderate intentionalist, which involves a combination of disconnected and connected analysis. Neither is right or wrong, they are just different academic styles of analysis. But here's the thing. Death of the Author applies to academic analysis. Now, I love academic analysis so much, but not everyone responds to the work of an author that way. And they are not wrong for responding in a different way to how someone like me might respond. They are also not right for responding similarly to me. I'm not in the right or the wrong when I analyze, or at least not necessarily. And here's the big problem. Human beings create works of art, and human beings can be unethical. And if you find someone to be unethical, then the question becomes, are you unethical for consuming the thing they have created? This is all wrapped up in Death of the Author, but just how far does that death apply? When an abusive artist gets your money in exchange for their art, how far are you complicit in their abuse? You are funding their abuse, in a sense, and that's where it gets tricky, and that's the thing people don't want to talk about. But hey, I don't do this whole video thing to shy away from topics that some people don't want to think about. So, let's think about it, because Death of the Author is great for analysis, but the real world exists external to analysis, doesn't it? You can preach Death of the Author when saying you can enjoy the work to people who are bad people because the work and the author are separate. But can you really? Part 2. Some problematic authors to consider. Now we get to the uncomfortable part. Let's talk about some people whose work I love. Some people whose work now produces an ethical quandary for me. We are going to look at 3 mediums here: music, games, and lastly books, or one series of books by one author. And it's the problematic author that's the big problem at present in the queer communities I frequent. It's going to be fun. Part 2.1. Music. We're going to look at 2 musicians today, and the first one is Dave Mustaine. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with him, he was the original lead guitarist for the thrash metal band Metallica. But he was kicked out of the band rather abruptly for his drunken behaviour. He was, by his own admission, an aggressive drunk, and although he doesn't wholly blame the band anymore, acknowledging his own actions that led to his firing, he still harbours some strong feelings in that direction. However, he didn't just fizzle away after departing from Metallica, and he instead formed the thrash metal band Megadeth. And he found a lot of success there. Now, his behaviour is definitely something problematic, such as his repeated vicious attacks against Kirk Hammett, the guitarist who replaced him in Metallica, but he has calmed down, and the whole situation between him and his old band have mostly calmed down. They've even performed together since the breakup, but while his behaviour was often rather toxic, it was some of his other views that may cause an ethical dilemma for some. Mustaine considers himself a Christian. Now, that on its own is not an issue. There are many good Christians out there. But there are also Christians out there who use their faith as a way of attacking certain groups. And the group he doesn't seem to be too fond of is gay people. Now, he has not said that he's against gay people or hates them or anything, but rather that he's against gay marriage. Now, they claim you can be against gay marriage because marriage is supposedly a thing sanctified by God, even though various cultures have had marriage rituals, but whatever, so fine. Maybe he does genuinely believe that, but the phrase, "I'm not against gay people, just gay marriage," is often a dog whistle that allows you to pretend you're not homophobic while being homophobic. However, Mustaine himself has stated that his words were taken out of context and that he doesn't hate gay people. He thinks that people should love who they love, but that he's Christian, so he isn't gay or anything like that. Be who you want to be is his message, which is better than blatant homophobia, but still comes across like the kind of thing someone would say who believes sexuality is a choice. So maybe not blatant homophobia, but definitely not supportive. Now, I choose this first one because it's relatively mild. He wasn't screaming homophobic slurs or attacking a gay person, but it certainly can be construed as implicitly hostile towards gay people. And I also chose this one first because while I love Metallica, I only really love 2 Megadeth songs, Peace Sells and Symphony of Destruction for those interested. And so it really isn't difficult for me to distance myself from Megadeth love. And this is also more in the grey area. So would it be ethical to continue listening to Megadeth, or are his statements alone not enough to receive a genuine backlash? I mean, his views don't appear to have had much traction in the grand scheme of things. Like, ask the average person who Dave Mustaine is, and they probably wouldn't know. So, is the potential damage done by his statements minimized because he's not that famous a figure? Does that matter? Surely, a bad action is bad regardless of who does it. But let's move on for now. But before we do, one last thing about Mustaine. He seems to be kind of buddy-buddy with Alex Jones, so make of that what you will. Now, it was easy for me to mostly write off Dave Mustaine and to not consider myself a Megadeth fan or to highlight his work to others. Because I personally don't much like the homophobic stuff. Call me new-fashioned, but I don't believe in denying rights to people because of their sexuality. And being against gay marriage means being against gay people's right to marry. So, even if it's a bit more on the mild side, it's still not great. But cutting him off was easy for me, but maybe not to others. I like 2 of his songs too, that's not much. So it didn't take much for me to leave it behind, to take the ethical high road. However, the next person was much more difficult for me personally because I don't just like 2 of his songs, I like a hell of a lot of his songs, and that's Marilyn Manson. Now, before we begin with chatting about him, it's important to note the distinction between Marilyn Manson and Marilyn Manson. There's Marilyn Manson, whose real name is Brian Warner, and he's the lead singer and lyricist for Marilyn Manson, a band with the same name. However, we will be discussing both of them because the ethical issues surrounding him encompass them both. So, the man himself has always gone for shock value, and he was all about scaring Christians in the 90s and 2000s. He liked to have a variety of religious imagery in his videos, calls to rage, and, of course, his encouragement for young people to rebel against the status quo. Now, those things are considered immoral by certain people, generally people of a religious persuasion. I, however, was more than happy to be on board with all of that. So that's not the immoral stuff. The immoral stuff is the fact that he has been accused by a multitude of women of various forms of abuse, sexual, physical, and emotional, with the sexual abuse sometimes masquerading as BDSM, and he would verbally berate his partners too. 2 of the accounts listed in the linked article are particularly vicious. One recounted how he threatened to bash one woman's face in with a baseball bat while he held said baseball bat, and another had him pulling a gun on a woman and holding it to her head. So, this isn't casual homophobia that you might be able to hand-wave away. This is a series of allegations that allege a plurality of abuses over a lengthy span of years. This isn't some aging rocker's words, this is some aging rocker's actions. Which, if you go by the old saying, are louder than words. Now it is, of course, important to note that these are allegations. But that shouldn't be a cause for dismissing them. Witness testimonies in court could also be called allegations, yet they are considered evidence. And, in addition to this, he is under investigation for this domestic abuse. And that means that the story is still ongoing at time of writing, but any major updates will be added to the description below as time goes on. So, those are his actions, his incredibly immoral actions, his criminal actions. And here's the question then, should we cut him off and stop listening to his music? He certainly did enough bad things to warrant that at the very least, and he has enough money to live the rest of his life without releasing another album. So it's not like it'd be dooming him to starvation. Now, the issue with him and myself is that I was never into him in my teenage years like many others, and instead got into his music in my 20s. It resonated with me far more than I think it would have in my teens. But that does also mean that his music hasn't been in my life for that long. But I do still adore his music. So would the moral thing be to never buy his records? Yes. However, if you listen to his music on Apple Music, Spotify, YouTube, etc., well, you're still ultimately sending him money. Okay, so if you pirate his music, well, then yeah, nothing is going to him and he's not being actively rewarded, but isn't ethics about the principle of the thing? If we go more consequentialist and look at the consequences of pirating his music, well then he doesn't get anything from it. But if we go more deontological and look at it as a moral duty, then surely it would be wrong to listen to what he's created regardless of whether or not he is being monetarily rewarded. So, you could pirate his music and listen to it, and I would argue that you're not doing anything wrong there. Or if you already own his music, then you might as well keep it, because the alternative would be destroying them. And if it's digital ownership, then I don't know, you could delete them or something. The whole problem with ethics is that there isn't a right answer, because someone could easily come up and say that pirating his music is theft, and so that's immoral. I would personally disagree, but some people may choose to see that as immoral too. So, the most ethical thing would likely be to completely cut yourself off from his music and to never promote it yourself, to never praise it, and to never suggest others check it out. Which is where it comes to something of an interesting case for me specifically. You see, I've already spoken about two people who I have an ethical problem with, and so I am kind of promoting them. This may be labeled as bad publicity, but marketing people already have that covered. There is no bad publicity after all. But I have one more issue, and this will also come up again in the later sections. Marilyn Manson is a man, but it's also a band, and that band contributed to the music as a collective. Sure, Manson, the man, is the front man for the group, and he does all the lyrics, but he doesn't do all the instruments. We don't know what came from who. Maybe a guitarist one day gave some advice on lyrics, and maybe one day Manson gave some advice on chords. Music, when produced by a band, is a collaborative medium. Do they all deserve to go down for the actions of one of them? Although, of course, you could immediately argue that the band members may have known about Manson's actions and chose to do nothing about it. And so they are complicit. Accomplices in their silence. And that certainly does make the whole thing harder, but I think it would be reasonable to think that they knew what he was doing and still chose to do nothing. And so we can probably safely stay away from the music of Marilyn Manson, the band, if we want to be ethical. But the next thing we're going to talk about is a bit more complicated. Part 2.2: Games. Video games, aside from a select few indie projects, are a collaborative medium. Games are not designed by people who are somehow amazing designers, programmers, artists, voice actors, and animators. You see, you usually specialize in just one of those things, and so it's not uncommon for games to be made by hundreds of people. However, we are going to be looking at a more restrained development. We're going to be looking at one of the devs who worked on the indie darling Night in the Woods. The game itself is all about a young woman named Mae Borowski. She is an anthropomorphic cat who recently dropped out of university and moves back in with her parents. And so it's pretty much a super millennial narrative. The game released to glowing reviews and definitely managed to get a whole load of people super invested in the story and characters, myself included. The game is also quite a progressive thing, and so even though all the characters are anthropomorphic animals, people manage to see themselves in these characters. So that's the game. It's delightful, and it has a wonderful art style. Here's where the issues come in though. In 2019, 2 years after the game's release, one of the devs in the small team, Alec Hololka, was accused of abusive behavior. In the midst of a short-lived Me Too movement that saw a number of people come forward about various people in the games industry, Zoe Quinn, another indie developer, came forward on Twitter and gave a lengthy testimony about how Hololka sexually, verbally, and emotionally abused her when they dated several years before. She acknowledged that he was suffering from mental issues, but that she felt she needed to come forward. She received a lot of support, but she also received a lot of backlash. She was a central figure in the Gamergate movement, and so many immediately called her a liar. The attacks she received would only amplify with what came next, because the other Night in the Woods devs cut ties with Hololka, and the game's publisher Finji agreed with the decision, and various devs came out in support of Quinn and other survivors. But then, Alec Hololka, only a few days after the accusations came to light, took his own life. This abruptly put a stop to people coming forward about other abusers in the industry. His sister, Eileen Hololka, announced the news on Twitter saying, "Alec Hololka, my brother and best friend, passed away this morning. Those who know me will know that I believe survivors, and I have always done everything I can to support survivors, those suffering from mental illnesses and those with chronic illnesses. Alec was a victim of abuse, and he also spent a lifetime battling mood and personality disorders. I will not pretend that he was not also responsible for causing harm, but deep down, he was a person who wanted only to offer people care and kindness. It took him a while to figure out how. Over the last few years, with therapy and medication, Alec became a new person. The same person he had always been, but without any of the darkness. He was calm and happy, positive and loving. Obviously, change is a slow process, and it wasn't perfect, but he was working towards rehabilitation and a better life. It appears that, according to his sister, he was trying to be a better person, and he was trying to improve himself. But does that excuse his behavior in the past? His sister clearly didn't think so, even though it cost him his life. And because he had died, people decided to use that as an excuse to attack Quinn for coming forward in the first place. To which Eileen had a further response. And in case it's not already fucking obvious, Alec specifically said he wished the best for Zoe and everyone else, so don't use our grief as an excuse to harass people. Go outside, take care of someone, and work towards preventing these kind of things in the first place. So, according to her, his death should not be used as an excuse to harass the people who came forward in the first place. And this is a much more sensitive topic because we tend to act as if someone cannot be criticized once they have died. The question then becomes a dual question. Did he rob his victims of justice? Or did his victims rob him of life? And that second question should make people uncomfortable. If you want to blame his victims, then that makes him the victim. And yes, he did commit suicide, an act he ultimately undertook of his own free will, but his victims did not take on abuse of their own free will. They did not decide to be on the receiving end of abuse. Also, his sister later wrote a lengthier piece about transformative justice, and it's worth the read. You can find it in the references below. Now we come to the whole purpose of this video. Alec Hololka abused someone, but then took his own life. Should we refuse to engage with his work any longer? He is dead, and some might say that that is paying the price. But others might say that those he abused will never receive closure now. They will never see their abuser face justice. Now, what makes this a bit harder is Night in the Woods. If we are looking at ethical consumption of media by those who are unethical, Night in the Woods was made by several people. People who immediately severed ties with Hololka after the allegations come to light. Should their work, because it is collaborative, also be considered null and void because of association? And let's just expand this as a hypothetical. If there were a big budget game or movie, because that also works, and it turned out that the director was an abuser, would that discount the project? That's an easier one for some to decide on because a director has larger control over the finished product. Well, what about a camera operator? If one of the people who operates the camera is an abuser, should that discount the entire film? Sure, that person doesn't have complete creative control, but shots in that film were creatively decided by that person. How far down does it go? If we agree that these kinds of mediums are collaborative, then does it matter who in the team has done something unethical? Shouldn't it make the entire production unethical? If we want to only blame those that have more creative control over something, then aren't we denying that these kinds of mediums are collaborative and that every worker is important? The same goes for music. If we once again look at Marilyn Manson, the band members may have been complicit, but what about the sound engineer who masters their records? What if we take that same sound engineer and let's just assume that he was also aware of Manson's abuse, and so he's also complicit, and say he goes and masters the album of another unrelated musician. This musician has never done anything unethical, but has the unethical nature of that sound engineer's complicity now rendered that innocent musician complicit? Should we also discount that musician's work because it was mastered by someone who knew and never reported the abuses of one of their colleagues? Now, we are getting really bogged down in this kind of ethical line of thinking. And I'm not raising these questions to try and undermine the question of whether or not we should stop supporting those who have committed abuses, but rather to show how complicated the whole thing is, to show how difficult it is to live an ethical life. But we're still not done. Because someone like me finds it rather easy to stop supporting the work of these people. I love Marilyn Manson's music, but I can stop listening. And the whole Night in the Woods thing is difficult for me because of how much it resonated with me. But it really was more the story that resonated with me, and the story was not written by Halolka, although that doesn't mean he didn't inject tons of influence into the finished work. And to make matters worse, when I was recording footage for the section, I couldn't help but replay the entire game, even though I only needed a few minutes of footage. This game it resonates with me. But anyway, the next one is one that was particularly difficult for me and a whole load of people. And some might already know what's coming next, because the next person never, or at least to my knowledge, physically abused anyone herself. But her reach and power means that what she has done may be more damaging than what all these other people have done. Part 2.3. Books.
So, before we continue on with books, I just thought that, it was maybe worth just talking a little bit about personal story here, about my particular experience with this next person. You see, my entire life, I've basically just had 4 heroes, literary heroes. It's like as a writer and a person who loves literature and what have you, I've really only had 4. So the first one, from when I was a very young man back in the day, I was really, really into Lord of the Rings, and then I read the books. Tolkien was obviously, love Tolkien. Now I'm a little bit more an old person, so now I'm like, oh yes, I still enjoy Lord of the Rings. I enjoy it, but I have moved on, I have aged. But there's always that little part of me, it's like, oh, Tolkien. So Tolkien is the oldest in terms of his world, because I watched the movies before I read the books. But then, after that came, next is the person we're going to talk about, but after that came Stephen King. He was the third big influence. Now, as an older, pretentious person who's, done literature at, like, university, because I'm a nerd, I don't think he's that great a writer. I think that his stories are good. I think if he was, like, he was the idea man and somebody else wrote the books, I think it might be better, but his dialogue has always been magnificent, to me, at least. So, Tolkien, then mystery person, who we're going to be talking about, and then Stephen King. And the fourth person, and this was once I got to university, I sort of became enamored by a guy we've already spoken about, Roland Barthes, who I only sort of looked up how to pronounce his name after I heard a YouTuber calling it Barthes, because I just said Barthes, because that's how it's spelled. And, I never heard any of these people's names. I read all of it. I did all of my university from home. So I read everything. I didn't hear any lecturers saying the names of these people and stuff. But he was just, his analyses of things just kind of completely changed the way I looked at things. And as many academics I love now, other ones, I just kind of, it's always Barthes, goes back to Roland Barthes for me. And so I kind of had 3 big literary influences and then 1 big academic influence. So 4 heroes. Those are my 4 heroes. Tolkien died in 1973, I think. He died before my mother was born, so he died a long time ago. Then, of course, Stephen King. Well, mystery number 2. Number 3, Stephen King is still alive, and I'm pretty chilled with him. For the most part, like on Twitter, I like him and stuff like that. Roland Barthes, he died in the 80s. So, none of these people could really disappoint me except for number 2. And that's why we come to number 2, who I have a issue with, and we're going to be talking about why I have an issue with her. But that person is J.K. Rowling. Now me, of my 4 literary heroes, or 3 literary heroes, 1 academic hero, of those 4 people, one of them turned out to be a problem. And J.K. Rowling is also, in many ways, kind of the most influential one on me, because, yes, like Tolkien, sure, it was the movies, and then the books came later. Like, I read the books when I was like a teenager. I watched the movies when I was a child. So, very, very different things. But I'm one of those people who started reading because of J.K. Rowling. So you could kind of say that all of my trajectory in life can be linked back to J.K. Rowling. And that's why it's going to be. So it's really been difficult with J.K. Rowling for a lot of people, not just for me. Obviously, she isn't actually going up against me, going up against other people, but it's just not nice to see. So, with that in mind, because I've been kind of quite cold and sort of analytical with a lot of this stuff, but you should always remember that when it comes to, say, these things like, obviously we've spoken about, like, say, Dave Mustaine, if you're not gay, you might be like, who cares? And also, if, say, for instance, like me, you kind of go, well, I don't really care about the institution of marriage. You sort of go, well, who cares? But it's a right. Right? You have, like, the right to get married to whoever you want. As a matter of fact, say, in my country, South Africa, under apartheid, it was not legal to marry in different races. So it kind of harkens back to that kind of idea of, like, not being allowed to marry. Bad. So I look at that and I go, ugh. The idea of not allowing someone to marry, like, I don't believe in marriage, but if you want to get married, it's up to you. And so gay people should be allowed to get married because it's a right that everybody else has. So that's why I'm like, no, Dave Mustaine, you're kind of a dick. And then Marilyn Manson, that's completely different. He didn't say anything. He did things. That's much easier to sort of, be like, yeah, no, he's an abuser. And then Alec Holker, also an abuser, but of course, what makes that difficult is because he worked with a team, and also, of course, the fact that he did take his own life. But it's always important to remember that ethics isn't just some abstract thing. It does actually hurt people. Okay? If you were a gay fan of Megadeth, and now he's saying this shit, that's, try to think of it from that perspective. Try to think, well, imagine if I were a gay fan of Megadeth, and now he's believes I shouldn't have the same rights as straight people. And Marilyn Manson, you should just be like, well, abuser. But you shouldn't be like, oh, shame, poor Manson. You say, well, it really sucks for the people who were abused, and so we should maybe, not support him. And then Alec Holker, abuser as well. But that one is a bit more complicated because of the whole extra situation that came with it. But it's important to remember that ethics shouldn't just be some abstract thing. There are real people on the other side who get hurt by people. You should always remember that with ethics. But this is enough of a little tangent, so let's get back into that more academic-y, kind of, not mean-spirited, but, a bit more mean way. So let's get back to it. See you at the end.
So, now we have to get to someone who never personally abused anyone, or at least not to my knowledge, but rather someone who used their considerable platform to spread hate. They say never meet your heroes, and I've never met J.K. Rowling. But Twitter exists. Now, I've actually spoken about her before, and I discussed her and Death of the Author in an opinion piece on my blog, unoriginally titled J.K. Rowling and Death of the Author. However, it wasn't about ethics, and was instead about something entirely unrelated. I published it before all this other stuff happened. And if you want to see a more straightforward application of Death of the Author and J.K. Rowling's work, well then the link will be down below. So, with that out the way, we can talk about J.K. Rowling. I always considered myself a huge fan until I got old enough to face the reality that all her books past Prisoner of Azkaban were kind of bad. Not terrible, but just not for me. But I always held an indebtedness to her because of her influence, because her books were the thing that got me reading in the first place, and I kinda ended up studying literature at university, so you can pretty much trace my love of books all the way back to Mrs. Rowling herself. So, for those who don't know why J.K. Rowling became a problem, let me explain. She kinda got transphobic over the last few years. There were a few stops and starts here and there, but it really started with a tweet she made. And her December 2019 tweet read, "Dress however you like, call yourself whatever you want, sleep with any consenting adult who'll have you, live your best life in peace and security, but force women out of their jobs for stating that sex is real? Hashtag I stand with Maya. Hashtag this is not a drill." Okay, so let's rewind a bit. This all happened because there was a researcher who I will not actually name, although it's kind of obvious what her first name is considering the hashtag I stand with Maya thing. And this person made several transphobic comments, and so her contract was not renewed with the institution she was working at. However, she claimed that she was simply gender critical and not transphobic. However, this case became public, and Rowling gave her support to this researcher. And she did it in a very condescending way. That tweet that says, "Dress however you like"? Yeah, that's not what transgenderism is. Call yourself whatever you like? That's reductionist and harmful. Sleep with any consenting adult who'll have you. That's just plain offensive. Like, yeah, if someone will even have you. And then the last sentence, "but force women out of their jobs for stating that sex is real?" A rhetorical question meant to make you get all gaspy, because of course sex is real. But the problem is that the phrase sex is real is an attempt to make transgender people go away. Because what you're basically saying is, you'll never be the gender you claim to be. Also, that researcher lost her court case about being unfairly fired. Now, this video is not about the metaphysics of gender. Maybe one day I'll make a video about gender, but today we're looking at ethics. So, even if you disagree with the whole concept of gender being more fluid, you can maybe still try to understand how a tweet like this from a beloved author would feel like an attack against trans people. When people go after trans people, they don't generally say, "death to trans people." They usually say that they're just concerned about young people making a transition that they could never possibly understand, or maybe they'll say that trans women are an attack on lesbians, and that we just care so much about gay women now. I don't hate trans people, but I just think that women's rights are being eroded by these trans women who are all over the place now. Because as we all know, when one group gets rights, another group has to lose them. That's why when black people got the vote, we had to take the vote away from another minority. Or am I remembering history wrong? Anyway, Rowling continued with the more transphobic stuff about 6 months later. June 2020, she posted once again on Twitter, and this time said, "People who menstruate? I'm sure there used to be a word for those people. Someone help me out. Wamban, wimpund, woomad." Once again, incredibly condescending. This was in response to a group trying to be more open in their language so that, for instance, non-binary people could be included. But no, she had to attempt to belittle those people instead. You see, it's all about how worried she is about young people. Or as her July 2020 tweet said, "Since speaking up about gender identity theory, I've received thousands of emails, more than I've ever had on a single subject. Many have come from professionals working in medicine, education, and social work. All are concerned about the effects on vulnerable young people. See? She's just so concerned about the vulnerable young people who don't know any better. But anyway, she then wrote this lengthy essay on her website that talks about all the abuse she received because of those tweets, which obviously shouldn't be condoned. Don't attack people, don't send death threats, etc. You'd think that was obvious, but apparently not. And she also spoke about how she's just worried about women's rights. Check. Gay rights. Check. And young people. Check. She also doesn't like being called a TERF because that's just mean. She just loves biological women. And she also quotes some famous feminists like Simone de Beauvoir, because reverting to the words of experts lends credibility to the one using those words. However, she does say that trans people should be protected, but these young people are just vulnerable. And they might be hit with this trans trend if this gender politics isn't stopped. So yeah, her essay says a lot of panic-inducing things, such as this direct quote. When you throw open the doors of bathrooms and changing rooms to any man who believes or feels he's a woman, and as I've said, gender confirmation certificates may now be granted without any need for surgery or hormones, then you open the door to any and all men who wish to come inside. That is the simple truth. There's nothing more invigorating than trying to cause a panic where one shouldn't be. Apparently, some people learn nothing from earlier moral panics like the Salem witch trials or McCarthyism. Now, J.K. Rowling and many others are victims of online attacks. Sending threats to people is never justifiable. But here's something that the so-called gender-critical people don't ever ask themselves. Okay, how would this feel if I were a trans person? Maybe people should try to step outside their own perspective and try to see it from another point of view. Maybe. So, that's the story of why J.K. Rowling is maybe not the most ethical person. She lodged her support behind various transphobic talking points and thereby gave them a megaphone. Actions like these, even if you claim you want to protect trans people, is just the thing that some people need to funnel their hatred. Some people will take that information and they will see that someone as high profile as J.K. Rowling believes as they believe. Well, then they may just get that nice extra push they need to start doing some hate crimes. And it's not like trans hate crimes and discrimination in the UK, where J.K. Rowling lives, weren't already bad before she decided to weigh in. Words have consequences, and those consequences could very well lead to violence against the people that Rowling has decided to target. I could go on and explain a concept called a speech act and how it relates to hate speech, but I don't think that I should have to explain that hate speech can lead to hate crimes. It should be kind of obvious. There are many historical examples of people riling others against a group that they deem bad in some or other way. So, J.K. Rowling did a bad thing. And she clearly doesn't think that she did a bad thing, and so it should be rather obvious that we should cut her off. We should not consume her work and further add to her considerable wealth. She did something unethical, and so we should respond by cutting her off. And this one is a lot easier than with a band. J.K. Rowling is a solitary person, and she writes her books herself. However, just because she wrote them doesn't mean that she has complete creative control over them. Her editors, her agent, her publishers, the people she entrusted to read her book before she sent it, all of these people could have affected the work that ultimately lands up on a published page. They are all the author, not just her. She's the main one, to be sure, but others definitely affected her judgment. So while I agree that I will never contribute to her again, unless of course she does one day actually come around and makes amends for what she did, although many disagree on whether or not that is possible, the damage is done after all, but should those other people, those people who contributed, also be held to account? They may not have said the transphobic things, but they did ultimately help her rise to the point where she could have the platform she eventually used to bring up anti-trans talking points. Like before, when we spoke about the hypothetical sound engineer, do these people now carry around this unethical weight? That's not something I can decide for others. For myself, though, I don't really know. It's an immensely difficult dilemma, and one that I think we should all spend a little more time thinking about. Part 3. Ethics is complicated. It's way too complicated. In my first video on this channel, I spoke about post-colonial rewriting, the act of taking the work of something colonial and reworking it to be a criticism of colonialism. And maybe something similar will happen in the future with the work of unethical people. Maybe one day, when the copyright expires, people will take the work of a certain transphobe and turn her narrative on its head to directly counteract her words and actions. You never know. But the time for that is likely quite far into the future. The reason people can use Robinson Crusoe to criticize people like Daniel Defoe is because that book and that man lived several hundred years ago. So maybe we'll still need quite a bit of time before we start critically engaging with the work of modern unethical people. It's easy to ignore a particular work of art that is inherently racist or transphobic or some other is/phobic, but it can be harder to ignore when the work itself isn't a problem, but the person behind it is. We also don't know what's going on inside people's heads. We don't know whether or not the creator of a children's cartoon is secretly racist. We don't know their inner lives. And if we did, it might be easier to cut certain people off. And cutting people off financially may be seen as a good punishment, such as not buying their games or movies or comics, but that only serves as a punishment in a capitalistic world. And by being angry at certain people or by trying to get them in trouble for their views, you might be inadvertently providing them with free advertising. Then the people who are openly transphobic will buy that person's books as a way of sticking it to the libs. So there's kind of no winning. Also, simply cutting someone off from finances, such as by pirating their work, still shows silent support for their work. Sure, you're not paying them for it, and maybe you don't talk about it on a public platform, but you might recommend it to friends or family, and that means you're still supporting this unethical person. Maybe the most ethical thing would be to cut it out entirely. Never buy it, never pirate it, never discuss it. But that doesn't undo past support. Support that you couldn't have known would be benefiting a bigot, but it still did. And this also doesn't call to attention another thing, the concept of forgiveness. If someone does something unethical and then pays the cost for their moral crime, are they now off the hook? Or will they be forever tainted? I mean, who among us hasn't had problematic viewpoints in our ignorant youth? Things we now identify as terrible and not representing us at all. Surely, we all have the right to change our minds. But that does, of course, only apply to those who have said terrible words rather than performed terrible deeds. Making ignorantly racist jokes in your youth isn't exactly the same as sexual abuse. And also, you can forgive teenagers the terrible things they might say, but once you become an adult, you have to grow up already. You can't keep needing second chances on bigoted things. But one second chance isn't so bad, is it? I have purposefully only once directly referenced the concept of cancel culture in this video, because much of what entails a supposed cancellation is just another word for consequences, and some people are finally having to face consequences for what they have said and done over the years. And they don't like that. It's not nice, coasting your way through life with no repercussions, and now suddenly Twitter is holding you accountable? But we all learn about consequences when we're children, or at least we should. Now, why did I go through this rambling list of people and the ethical dilemmas behind them? Well, just to show that it's kind of complicated. Many people want to act as if ethics and morality is something black and white. These people are the bad people, and these are the good ones. But ethics is grey. It's always grey. And these people, in my opinion, deserve to face repercussions for their actions. But I'm not the arbiter of what is morally correct. None of us are. It's an area of debate. But as a warning to all those authors out there who do create things, maybe try to live your life in such a way that people one day don't have to debate whether or not it would be ethical to support your work. Just live an ethical life. Or at least do your best to try.
Hey again. So, welcome back. It's now the end of the video. I just wanted to sort of step on a few points, just as sort of a rounding off of things. I went kind of abstract with some things, going a bit more on the sort of philosophical perspective with some of these things, like when I proposed the hypothetical of, say, the sound engineer and the people who worked with J.K. Rowling, these external people, you can't really entirely know whether they knew or felt they were complicit, or whether they were complicit, so that becomes a difficult thing. So those particular people are a hazy area. But let's just clarify some things, okay? For people who are like, oh, well, you didn't really take a stand. I did, but I feel like at some points, after I recorded everything, I felt like some points I wasn't quite firm enough on certain aspects. So, what aspects? Well, Dave Mustaine. I'm down with Dave Mustaine. I think that, no, he might not have the same reach as other people. He might not be as famous as the other ones. Nor likely you've never even heard of him unless you know metal. If you're a metal fan, you probably know Dave Mustaine because he's one of the 4 kings of thrash. So, you will probably know him then. But if you don't know metal, if you don't know thrash, you probably don't know him. So, who cares in that sense? But, doesn't matter. 2, Marilyn Manson. Cut him off. I love Manson's music. Oh, but doesn't matter. My feelings here don't actually matter. Because you should think, wait a minute, other people were abused. This isn't really about me. You should go, well, yes, I might love his music, but tough. If you actually want to take a stand from a moral perspective and say, I actually do believe in something, then you should actually stick to your convictions. So Manson is gone. Alec Lolka, that's harder. His work, other than Night in the Woods, I don't know any of his other actual solo work. And Night in the Woods was made by a couple of people, and I don't think that they should be dragged down for him because of what happened. So it's really difficult in that sense. That's the sort of the most complicated one. And as I said, I loved the game so much that when I just wanted to record a little bit of footage, I accidentally played the entire game again. Because I really love it. And then J.K. Rowling. The disappointer. J.K. Rowling, I haven't engaged with any of her stuff. I haven't really enjoyed any of her stuff in a long time anyway. I read The Cursed Child, and I thought it was... that was back a couple years back and stuff. I enjoyed, like, Fantastic Beasts, the first one, but then I didn't really care after that, and now I'm like, I'm not interested in any of that. I don't want to support her, I don't want to associate with her, and I think that that's the point. You need to take a moral stand and stick to your moral convictions. If you believe that these people should be punished for what they've done or said, then you should actually follow through. So while I love the first 3 Harry Potters, I won't support any of her work. Because I think that it's... shouldn't. That simple. And, yeah. That's pretty much it, eh? So, I promised I wouldn't take a centrist stance there. So there's my take. I won't engage with any of them anymore. Because I believe in having moral convictions and then sticking to them. So, that's that. I hope that you enjoyed the video. Stay tuned for more videos. And of course, you can also check me out on Twitter, where I mostly trash talk people from the games industry and sometimes poke fun at stories and stuff. And of course, my... yeah, that's pretty much it. And my podcast, which you can check out with my co-host. You can check that out. It's linked in the channel, related channels, the 2 Cent Report. So you can check that out. Should also be a fun time. Where we also get shitty about the games industry. We don't really get into this ethical stuff though, but you know. So yes, check that out. And we're going to visit ethics again. I'm going to do ethics a couple of times. I don't know when the next time will be, but we're going to do ethics again. Because it's complicated, and it's messy, and it's difficult. And I like it. So, farewell. And I hope that you have a great rest of the day. And think about your ethical convictions. Think about what you believe in. And then stick to that. If something changes your viewpoint, then reassess your viewpoint and see what you think. Does this still hold up to your ethical standards? What do you think? Can't be decided for you. I mean, you do get bad ethics, you know, but for the most part, ethics is a bit complicated. So, see you next time. And I hope that you have a great rest of day, great rest of week, month. Can't for certain say year, but let's say month. Stop there. Farewell.